Sri Lanka's most powerful news brand.
Hello and welcome to Crosstalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. Days ago, the U.S. Secretary of Defense James Mattis updated and revised America's global defense strategy. It is a dark vision of the world and calls for massive defense spending. What he calls a defense strategy, critics say, is a blueprint for wars without end. Cross-talking Endless Wars, I'm joined by my guest, Michael Vlahos in Washington. He is a professor of strategy at the Johns Hopkins University. Also in Washington, we have Christopher Naiwame. He is a former Army police sergeant, Iraq War veteran, and contributor to the Hill newspaper. And in Purcellville, we cross to Philip Giraldi. He is a former CIA counterterrorism specialist who is now executive director of the Council for the National Interest. All right, gentlemen, crosstalk rules in effect. That means you can jump in anytime you want, and I always appreciate it. Philip, let me go to you first in Purcellville. I read the report, and I will repeat what I said in my introduction. I found it to be a rather dark vision of the world. It was less about defense strategy than preserving or advancing hegemony around the world, and I find it remarkably lacking in any kind of discussion of international law. Go ahead, Philip.
Well, yes, I mean, international law did not enter into it. Yeah, it is not as it describes itself, a defense strategy. It's an offense strategy. And essentially, what it does, it takes away any genuine threats against the United States and against the American people, like ISIS, and it shifts the defense burden onto being competitive with other countries in the world, most specifically Russia and China. And essentially, it creates a case, if you want to call it that, for spending vast amounts of more money on defense, basically to promote American interests, which have nothing whatsoever to do with defending the country.
Okay, that was my reading as well. Michael, weigh in on that, okay? Of course, I think we would all agree that the United States has an adversarial relationship with Russia and China. I can accept that. They all have their own national interests, and they will pursue them. However, the way, shifting away from terrorism, taking away even talk of the climate, I got this feeling reading the report, we're going back into the 19th century of great power struggles here. The difference is these powers have nuclear weapons. Go ahead, Michael.
Well, this is primarily an exercise in strategic rhetoric. And as such, it lays out a kind of highly aggressive ceremonial strategy, what you might call a fierce face strategy. And that is simply because the U.S. has entered a historical period where its leadership is declining and will eventually find itself, say, like Spain did in the early 17th century, in a position where it can no longer orchestrate the kind of hegemonic status that it had come to define itself on. And so my sense is the U.S. is staking out highly aggressive histrionics and theater in order to maintain others' fear and in order to cloak the increasing insecurity that we feel. Because as you said, Peter, although we're pursuing a kind of endless war strategy, as Spain found out in the 17th century, endless war feeds on itself. And at the very end of that, you're kind of used up. And that's where we are now. We're entering into a kind of twilight period that may last as long as it did for Spain, as long as 40 years before we finally give up and say, well, we can't do this anymore.
Okay, Christopher, let me read some of the words from James Mattis when he was introducing the report here. But I found quite bewildering here. To those who threaten America's experiment in democracy, if you challenge us, it will be your longest and worst day. So what does this have to do with national security? I mean, who is attacking America's democracy other than then the Democratic Party cheating Bernie Sanders, and possibly the DOJ trying to undermine a legally elected president of the United States. I find it really quite galling that the defense secretary is talking about democracy when one can make the supposition that it's very challenged in the U.S. itself. Go ahead, Christopher.
Sure. I think that, Secretary Mattis is a Marine. He understands war. I understand war. And I think that taking this position, he's asserting himself. He's establishing a tenor on the global stage. And we're just sort of stating the obvious, that these are global powers on the end of a long history. I mean, post-World War II, the main power players have in some ways stayed the same, but the U.S. role has expanded. I actually look at this a little bit differently in reverse.
Sure.
I think the U.S. is focusing on nuclear deterrence, and the idea of this strategy is focused back on deterring nuclear powers, namely North Korea, from continuing to be aggressive while reducing endless war. I think Russia and the United States has both seen the experience of endless combat with forces that are sort of enigmatic, things like ISIS. There's ways to control those without having those endless conflicts. So it's a recalibration focused on principled security networks in Asia and preventing those kinds of conflicts. And yes, China and Russia are powerful nation states. They're sovereign, and those were the traditional, sort of power players. And so we're just focused on the basics.
Okay. Philip, can I read to you some more words from the Secretary? Quote, "We will develop enduring coalitions to consolidate gains we have made." Gains. I repeat, gains we've made in Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, and elsewhere to support the lasting defeat of terrorists as we sever their sources of strength and counterbalance Iran. I mean, gains, I don't know what he's talking about whatsoever. The candidate Trump said that he didn't want to go down the path of nation building. Well, the United States now is involved in nation building in part of Syria, okay? That path is being continued here. I can't see any gains in the countries that I just mentioned. I don't know what he's talking about, Philip.
Yeah, well, I don't either. I think that he's completely delusional. There's another comment in the report, or by Mattis, where it's in the report, basically says there's a confusion by the Russians, Chinese, and Iranians between civic issues and military issues. Now, what country in the world has confused civic and military issues more than the United States? So I really don't get this. I think that there certainly have been no gains, nothing but disasters in those countries that he cited. And there's other stuff in this report. I'm sorry, it's not a conventional laying out of American strategy moving forward. This is more so a ticket for mischief on the part of the administration. And there's if we go to the issue of nuclear weapons, obviously. Right. Nuclear weapons should be a major issue, and there's a comment in here that basically says that in the report that the United States, when confronted with issues of national importance like the standard of living of Americans, will be able to use nuclear weapons in a first strike capacity, and this is quite incredible stuff.
And that includes countries that do not have those kinds of weapons, I would like to point out as well. Okay, Michael, I'm really kind of confused here, and I want to ask the same question of Christopher, is this Donald Trump's foreign policy? Because it's stark contrast to what he ran on, okay? Everything that's going on right now from Yemen to Syria, again, Iran is being targeted here. I mean, it seems to be such a continuation. It doesn't seem to matter who's the president of the United States. It's the deep state that decides who our enemies are and how they will be dealt with, okay? Because I can't, the contrast is so great that I've never seen it from a candidate to a president in my lifetime. Go ahead, Michael.
Well, candidates get captured when they move from the campaign and from their own voice, however authentic or inauthentic it is, and then they get subsumed into the imperial worldview of the imperial city. And the courtiers, or the deep state, if you want to call it that instead, reshape their worldview. And in many ways, the overarching sensibility in Washington today in terms of strategy is one of tremendous anxiety and insecurity. And so a grandstanding strategy that looks like it's doing things, that looks aggressive, like the war on ISIS. It's all a wonderful kind of demonstration and display. The U.S. is not going to risk a big war with either China or Russia, but it will grandstand. Hence the 10,000 or so Barrett 50 caliber sniper rifles to Ukraine. That is grandstanding. The same with Rocket Man and North Korea. It's a way of the U.S. Boasting forcefully, but what I would bring home, I think, is the contrast between forceful boasting of Trump and the very much more successful forceful boasting of Teddy Roosevelt. And the difference is that Teddy Roosevelt was announcing America's debut on the world stage, and America had 40% of the world's manufacturing. Today, it's absolutely the opposite in terms of trends and direction.
Okay, let me go to Christopher. Christopher, you're an Iraq war veteran. I mean, if I could just ask you personally, I mean, it seems like we have a continuation of this mentality of empire. And I mean, for Iraq, it's been a disaster. For Afghanistan, it's always a disaster. But and what's happening in Syria here? But we don't seem to learn any lessons here. You were there. Do you see what the problem is here?
Right. I think there's a few different issues. I want to try to address as many as I can. I think that we're omitting several different things here. We're overlooking several different things. For one, I think the president's actually moving away from nation building. We're trying to get, for example, the Iraqi security forces and the Iraqi military has had significant gains against ISIS. We've been trying to empower them to take the reins and to be able to do that kind of fighting themselves. We've also omitted the fact that we've decimated the leadership of ISIS. We've kept them in a constant state of confusion. We've killed Osama bin Laden. There's several strategic victories that have occurred along the way. We also forgetting the U.S. military provides significant foreign aid to our allies. We still provide a blanket of security across Europe. We're protecting South Korea. We've been in a global leadership role for decades, and those are the kinds of issues we're focused on. There's no one trying to escape the United States the way they're trying to escape North Korea.
Let me jump in here. We're going to go to a short break, and after that short break, we'll continue our discussion on Washington's new defense strategy. Stay with our team. Welcome back to Crosstalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter LeBeau. To remind you, we're discussing Washington's new defense strategy. Okay, let me go back to Philip in Purcellville. And right before we went to the Christopher was talking about our alliances. Well, alliances are a transmission belt for war. We've seen this historically. And I'm thinking of the situation that the United States is facing with its NATO ally, Turkey. And Turkey's illegally invaded Syria. And we know all of the entanglements that the U.S. has found itself there with the Kurds and whatnot, and its NATO ally here. I mean, and then we had not too long ago, we had a Russian jet that was shot down by the Turks. Then you have, you have this Article 5 kick in here. It seems to me the United States is very dangerously involved in a potential war that it doesn't want to fight. And then we can bring up the issue of North and South Korea. You know what? They're talking. That's a good start, isn't it? And then we have this bluster coming out of Washington that maybe it's not enough. I mean, the South Koreans probably know best about their defense than anyone else. Go ahead, Philip.
Yeah, well, I have to agree with your premise, which is essentially that America's alliances have, in many ways, outlived their usefulness. Russia does not threaten the United States, does not really threaten Eastern Europe. It has a sphere of influence like every other country, but this does not amount to a threat. And NATO is dangerous in a way because NATO could very much involve the United States in a shooting war where it doesn't want to be in it. And I would comment on the situation between Turkey and Syria. Turkey is indeed attacking Syria, but Turkey has an interest in Syria. The PKK terrorism problem and the Kurdish problem for Turks is very real. Sure. The United States is illegally in Syria, so the United States shouldn't be throwing stones at anyone when it comes to the situation currently in Syria. And this whole concept of a 30,000-man border guard is just totally ridiculous. The Turks won't let it happen, the Syrians won't let it happen, and the Iraqis won't even let it happen.
Okay, you know, Michael, you mentioned Ukraine earlier here. I mean, explain, because I don't understand it. What is in the national interest of the United States of America to be giving offensive weapons to Ukraine when we know, and our viewers that have been watching Crosstalk over the years know the importance of the Minsk Accord? Okay, it's not perfect, but it's certainly slowed things down, cooled things down. Now we have legislation that is not reported in Western media that the Ukrainians have walked away from it unilaterally, and now they're very happily taking offensive arms. We have to be honest here. The prospect of a Ukrainian-Russian war is very real, folks. It's very real. But you wouldn't know that, and you wouldn't know that by reading Mattis's report. Go ahead, Michael.
The U.S. finds that its alliances, both NATO and its key alliances in East Asia and the Western Pacific, are like lifelines to America's claim to hegemony. So it is to American advantage to stir the pot in Eastern Europe and to create a situation where, you know, poor, helpless Ukraine is being threatened with deep violence by, you know, and this is an old metaphor going back to World War I, frankly, and the Germans in Belgium. And it's a way for the U.S. to maintain the saliency of its position in Europe, which it no longer has economically, and in the instance of good relations with Russia, would not exist in the strategic sense. But because European states, especially Germany, are unwilling to spend the money they need to on defense to do it themselves, which they could easily. Then the U.S. By creating, yes, I mean the Germans could simply double their defense budget, and it would be no larger a percentage of their GNP than it was during the Cold War. But the key here is that the U.S. is able to have it both ways. It's able to assemble a kind of crisis in which the U.S. is the absolutely essential partner, and its leadership is unquestioned. And frankly, it can do that because of the general disinterest by Germany in stepping up to taking over the leadership role in Europe when it comes to strategic issues. The U.S. is doing the same thing in Asia with Japan. And Japan is willing to be there as the sidekick of the U.S. under all circumstances, and therefore the U.S. is playing the same game, using the fruits of its absolute victory over Germany and Japan in World War II to continue what will increasingly be the fiction of U.S. world power in the future. Not tomorrow, but 15 years from now.
Okay, Christopher, Michael brings up a very good point. I mean, if you look at the GDP of the European Union is vast, okay? It equals the United States. Japan certainly isn't a poor country by any standard. South Korea is, for its size and population, is remarkably successful and very rich, by the way. Why can't they just carry their load for their own security interests? Because what does the U.S. get out of it? I mean, if something happens to the U.S., you think everyone's going to come to the U.S.'s aid from Europe and South Korea and Japan? I don't think so. Why would they? Go ahead.
I think that's a great point. I mean, I think President Trump has challenged NATO and Europe to put more financial resources into their own defense, and I think that would be a thing that we should be supporting. But I want to go back a step. I think we're still continuing to omit many, many different factors. For example, you know, we've sort of discussed the U.S. in this sort of dystopian light and the tone and this vision. People want to come to the United States. People are risking their lives to try and they're dying trying to get out of places like North Korea, where their governments and the way they behave is absolutely zero freedom, no freedom of the press, extremely dystopian. And in the case of Iran, you have an entire government that's stacked with clergy that's frankly extremely dystopian.
But excuse me, Christopher, but I mean, if I could interrupt you for a second, you know, but that has nothing to do with the defense of the United States. You're talking about values, and I suppose that's all fine, but it has nothing to do about protecting the sovereign country of the United States. The State Department should deal with these other issues here, okay? I mean, I'm serious. I mean, it sounds nice, but it has nothing to do with defense here. Let me go to Philip here. You know, Philip, I was doing a little bit of research before this program. You know, I was looking at, Republican Senator Robert Taft when NATO was started, and he was saying, why should we get involved in this alliance? Because then we lose the right to declare war. We're giving it over to an organization. Then you had Mike Mansfield, and in the 1970s, under the Nixon and Ford administrations, he was heavily lobbying for ending American presence in Europe because the war's been over. They're rich. They can take care of themselves. The reason why I'm bringing up this boring history for everyone is that where is the debate in the public, in the media, about what is being said in Mattis's report? There's almost none. I mean, I read a lot of the reviews. It's just, well, this is what he said. But there's no distilling of what he's talking about. It just passes it on as if these people are just stenographers in the media and don't question anything that is being written. We're questioning it honestly on this program. Go ahead, Philip.
Yeah, it's quite astonishing. I mean, the stories on this paper and on the comments by Mattis disappeared within 48 hours, and were hardly covered at all. And yet, this is, as I said in the beginning, this is a formula for offense. This is a formula for the United States to exercise its leadership by military offensive, and this is quite outrageous. And also the question
in what way we haven't done anything offensive
against states that don't have them.
Christopher, you wanted to jump in there? Go ahead.
Sorry?
You can let Christopher jump in.
Well,
Go ahead.
where's Philip? Where's Russia on North Korea missile testing and North Korea threatening Hawaii and making these aggressive stances? Does Russia support North Korea's continued nuclear proliferation and launching missiles? That's offensive.
I can answer that question very clearly, Christopher. If you had watched the proceedings at the United Nations Security Council when there was a vote against North Korea in which China and Russia did participate and did vote for the sanction, they also offered an alternative, a freeze for a freeze. And go back, you can watch it. It's on YouTube. It's very thoughtful. It's very thorough. But you had all of the other countries saying, North Korea bad. Okay? Well, I'm sorry. That's not very intellectual. It's not very helpful. Okay? So I would answer you, Christopher, that Russia and China have been extremely helpful in trying to diffuse those tensions. But it doesn't get any coverage in the media because that's not what people want to hear. Go ahead, Christopher.
No, well, it should be covered. I mean, that's a fair point. There should be more coverage. But when you look at these oil transfers, China's in a position to really do a lot more. I think there's a lot of opportunity and a lot of optimism to get some of those things to restrict.
Why doesn't the United States sit down with the North Koreans and have a conversation? What's so hard about doing that? You could actually say, we went the extra mile, instead of this rocket man nonsense. That's not helpful, okay? If the United States really wants to show it's responsible in the world, wasn't it sit down and talk seriously? And if it doesn't like the deal, walk away from it. But at least you talked. Go ahead. I'm just saying the obvious.
That's
here.
a fair point. That's a fair point. But I think we have a president that wants to see some results, and I think unfortunately a lot of our goodwill and a lot of our diplomacy has had diminishing returns. When you look at, for example, the Iran deal and other things, where we're able to get a little bit of cooperation, but what we have is continued nuclear proliferation, continued talk of aggression, and the U.S. is continuing to provide foreign aid, to continue to fund our allies in Europe and these sorts of other things. So I think those talks should happen, and I believe the U.S. is opening to talk to North Korea, but we need to see a sort of tone and center of cooperation, and we're continuing to see boasting of continued nuclear proliferation in the region. And remember, the defense security strategy, that's our document for us. There's nothing in there that is overtly offensive. It is a document that is reaffirming our perspective on building up the military, recalibrating relationships.
You're right, Christopher. It's written about the United States for the United States, but the whole world is watching, and the reaction from a lot of capitals is this is a very aggressive and a continuation of an aggressive foreign policy. The world does react to the most powerful country in the world. All right, gentlemen, I'm sorry we've run out of time. Many thanks to my guests in Washington and in Purcellville, and thanks to our viewers for watching us here at RT. See you next time, and remember, crosstalk rules.